He was a famous attorney well known for his passion to fight for justice. But on that day, things took a sharp turn when his own teenage son was accused of murder.
The print we lifted from the victim's sweatshirt is from your son.
He was cornered by the fate to decide between false and truth, between his son and justice. But his decision shocked the entire world.
It was that man. He killed him?
Welcome back to Paramount Recaps. I don't have many subscribers, but your single comment is a ray of hope to motivate me.
I want the truth! Slow down, Mom. But I'll never know.
Andy Barber took the stand in court, reflecting on his 10-year career as an assistant district attorney in Newton, Massachusetts, a role he no longer held. He's in court because he believes in justice and wants the truth to come out. Just a year ago, the Barber family's life was normal, like many others. Then, 10 months ago, everything changed when Ben Rifkin died. It started like any other day. Andy woke up his 14-year-old son, Jacob, for school. His wife, Lori, returned from her run and made coffee while Jacob studied for a test. Lori suggested a vacation to Mexico.
What about Mexico?
Oh, we're thinking about going there for Christmas.
Which excited Andy, but not Jacob. After Jacob left for school, Andy and Lori went to work. For Andy, it was a typical day of legal work until he received a troubling call and had to cancel his appointments. At school, during a chemistry lesson, an alarm sounded, announcing a lockdown. The police arrived, and Detective Paula Duffy informed Andy that a student, Benjamin Rifkin, was found dead in a nearby park.
He's Jacob's year at Archer. Jesus Christ, this poor man.
Andy was horrified. Knowing Ben was Jacob's classmate, this wasn't an accident. It was a brutal crime. The crime scene was contaminated by the passerby who found Ben, complicating the investigation. Andy got a call from Jacob, who said the school was on lockdown but didn't know why. Andy reassured him and didn't give details. Jacob seemed like he wanted to say more but didn't.
I'm over, took one good look at him and freaked.
Ben's phone was missing, and the murder weapon wasn't found. Lori, who was on a committee at an orphanage, heard about the lockdown from colleagues and immediately called Jacob. The incident was all over the news. The police questioned everyone, but no one saw anything suspicious. Late into the evening, the investigation continued. The students and teachers at Archer School held a memorial for Ben. Andy came home late, and Lori mentioned Jacob and his friend Derek were playing video games upstairs. After speaking with Ben's parents, Andy was shaken. The only clue was a partial fingerprint, but there were no database matches. Lori couldn't understand how this could happen. Derek's father picked him up, and Andy and Lori wanted to talk to Jacob about the incident. Jacob said Ben wasn't his friend, and many didn't like him because he was arrogant. Seeing Jacob was okay, his parents left him alone. They couldn't sleep, fearing for their son's safety. That night, Andy had nightmares. In the morning, Lori drove Jacob to school. The police continued gathering evidence and questioning witnesses. Andy's bosses thought his connection to the Rifkins might compromise his objectivity and assigned the case to Neil Logaitis. Andy believed Neil wanted to use the case to boost his career and disagreed with Neil's approach. Prosecutor Lynn Canavan decided to give Andy a chance. Detective Duffy got permission to take fingerprints from students and began interrogating Ben's classmates. Everyone insisted no one from school could have hurt Ben. Sarah Grohl asked Andy if he had talked to Jacob, hinting she knew something but didn't elaborate. In the hallway, Derek asked Sarah what she told the police, but she brushed him off. The case didn't progress that day. Detective Duffy suspected Leonard Patz, a recently paroled criminal living near the park, might be involved. Leonard had a history of similar crimes. Andy was unsure about questioning Leonard, fearing it might backfire legally. The police had no solid evidence, and Andy felt the pressure. A wake was held at the Rifkin house, which Andy and Lori attended. Everyone asked Andy for updates, but he couldn't share details. He decided to take Jacob home early, upstairs. Andy found Ben's father, Dan, crying in Ben's room, devastated. Dan's wife, Joan, couldn't even enter the room. On the way home, Jacob noted how fake Ben's classmates were at the funeral. Andy and Jacob stopped at a cafe for food, and Andy felt grateful his son was alive. That evening, Andy pored over the case files. Even after Lori went to bed, he couldn't stop thinking about it and kept calling Detective Duffy. He wanted to interrogate Leonard Patz. Suddenly, he received an anonymous link to online posts accusing Jacob of the crime, including comments from Derek. Shocked, Andy searched Jacob's room and found a hunting knife that could be the murder weapon. Everyone mourned Ben's death, and Lori didn't feel like running. Andy, sleepless, was about to tell Lori about the knife. They confronted Jacob about it in the morning. Jacob said he bought it at an army store a while ago and dismissed Derek's comments as mean-spirited. The parents were confused but kept the knife from Jacob. After Jacob left for school, Andy and Lori wondered why Derek would post such accusations. They decided to keep it quiet. Detective Jonathan Klein visited Leonard Patz's workplace, making Leonard nervous. The detective was about to question him. Andy decided to dispose of the knife, doing so far from the house. Lori called Andy, still worried about Derek's comments. Andy reassured her, saying people gossip. Leonard was brought in for questioning. He admitted being in the park, but denied hurting anyone. The detectives were skeptical due to his past, but didn't believe he was guilty. Andy insisted on re-interrogating Leonard to find the culprit quickly. Leonard repeated that he was in the park by coincidence. Leonard's temporary lawyer, Joanna Klein, arrived, filling in for his regular attorney. At a colleague's request, Joanna Klein needed to talk to the client directly, and Andy couldn't stop her. After some comments, everyone at school started looking at Jacob suspiciously. During recess, Sarah Grohl told him that Derek Yu was spreading more rumors about him. They agreed to talk later since Sarah's friends were waiting for her. Meanwhile, Park was swarming with police and volunteers, including some students, looking for clues. In the present, prosecutor Neil Logaitis asked Andy why he hadn't joined the search. Andy explained that as an assistant district attorney, he had other duties. He also mentioned finding a hunting knife in Jacob's room after the incident and throwing it away. As any concerned parent might, Andy believed his son couldn't be cruel. In the past, Dan Rifkin approached Andy, furious about his inaction after seeing a troubling post. Andy called his boss, Lynn Canavan, who asked him to come to the office immediately. Jacob, feeling like an outcast, walked home from school, avoiding police cars. Near the office, 2 officers told Andy they had orders from the prosecutor to escort him. Realizing the situation was serious, Andy met with Lynn, who revealed that Jacob's fingerprint was found on the victim's hoodie. Shocked, Andy insisted there must be a reasonable explanation. The prosecutor had requested a search warrant for their house and advised Andy to get a lawyer for Jacob. Despite Andy's protests, Lynn was just following protocol, and Andy would be put on paid leave while Neil Logaitis handled the case. Leaving the office, Andy tried to call Jacob. Lori, unaware of the situation, was busy at the orphanage and missed Andy's calls. Seeing the missed calls later, she immediately called Andy back and learned something was wrong with Jacob. Panicked, she rushed home, where police were already present. Detective Paula Duffy showed Andy the search warrant. Jacob wasn't home, and no one could reach him. Andy didn't interfere as his colleagues searched the house, seizing Jacob's laptop. Waiting outside, Andy tried to calm Lori when she arrived. Duffy, despite her sympathy, had to do her job. That evening, the search team found a knife in the park, but Jacob was still missing. Lori was worried, but Andy believed Jacob was just scared. He admitted to Lori that he had thrown away the knife. Duffy asked them to inform her if Jacob showed up. They learned a potential weapon was found, but Duffy had no details yet. The police searched everywhere for Jacob, who was hiding in a playground. He eventually surrendered, saying he hadn't harmed Ben, but got scared and ran away after finding him. When the Barbers were informed Jacob was at the police station, they went there immediately, not knowing what to expect. They were allowed to see Jacob, and Andy asked him to stay calm. The court would set bail tomorrow, and they could take him home. Jacob swore he was innocent, and his parents believed him. They couldn't understand why he hadn't told anyone about finding the body. Jacob had no explanation, just fear that he would be blamed. Before he was taken away, his parents hugged him, with Lori in tears. Sarah, who ran a personal blog about singing, ignored the incoming messages. Dan and Joan Rifkin were informed that Jacob was the main suspect, and Derek's mother was told too. Andy and Lori's lives were forever changed. They couldn't help their son, who was now in a cell. Andy wanted to say something to Lori, but couldn't find the words. They needed to try to sleep. Leonard Patz sat in a cafe until closing, his phone containing photos of Ben Rifkin, which he deleted. The next morning, the Barbers went to court. Andy had arranged to meet Joanna Klein, their lawyer, at the courthouse. She was the best in town. Many journalists gathered outside the courthouse. Joanna, who would defend Jacob, advised the Barbers to show no emotion during the trial, as any reaction could be used against them. Jacob, being taken to the courthouse, saw children boarding a school bus through the barred window. Joanna explained that the public viewed both Jacob and his parents as guilty, and any anger would confirm their worst suspicions. Following her advice, the Barbers remained stoic and didn't answer any press questions, which was especially hard for Lori. In the courtroom, Andy exchanged glances with Neil. The school had already informed students about Jacob's arrest, urging them to come forward with any information. Andy was haunted by terrifying memories. The judge read the charges against Jacob. The prosecutor requested a $500,000 bail. Citing a high flight risk, the defense objected, and the judge set bail at $10,000, considering the risk low. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for August 21st. The Barbers posted bail immediately. Joanna explained how to handle reporters. Reunited with Jacob, they hugged him tightly. Surrounded by journalists as they left, the Barbers became a public spectacle. Lori felt sorry for Andy having to endure this. Journalists gathered outside their house too. Jacob was exhausted and fell asleep in the car. Later, his parents expressed their pride in him for holding up well during the court session. Jacob was upset about his seized laptop and phone, but Andy promised to get him new one. The Barbers received anonymous threatening calls, turning their life into a nightmare. Sarah, doing homework, ignored numerous messages. Derek, who had spoken with the prosecutor several times, tried to video call her, but she ignored him. Lori couldn't bear the news and articles about Jacob. She was sure this would haunt him forever. Andy decided to confess something about his family, specifically his father, to Lori. Later, the Barbers met with Joanna, who explained that under Massachusetts law, teenagers Jacob's age are tried as adults for serious crime. They wondered why Jacob never mentioned Ben bullying him. Jacob said he wasn't the only one with conflicts with Ben. Joanna reassured them that fingerprints are usually circumstantial evidence with simple explanations. Jacob was surprised to learn about his grandfather's imprisonment for a serious crime. Andy had hidden this out of shame. Jacob asked what his grandfather did, and Andy revealed that his father had killed a woman 17 years ago in a manner similar to Ben's case. Joanna assured them that Neil Logitis couldn't use this against them, although it might tarnish their image. Jacob was feeling sick, so he went to the restroom. Lori said she wouldn't put up with any more lies in their family. She was mad that Andy didn't tell her about his dad right away, and that Jacob hadn't mentioned his conflicts with Ben or finding the body. Later, they talked about everything that had happened recently. They couldn't even eat at a cafe in peace because everyone was staring at them. That night, Andy went to Detective Paula Duffy's house. She had just brought her daughter home, whom she saw every 2 weeks. Duffy wasn't happy to see Andy because if anyone found out, she'd be taken off the case. Andy wanted his laptop and Leonard Patz's personal file. Convinced the police had the wrong guy, Duffy refused. They were colleagues, not friends. At the trial, Neil Logitis asked Andy about the first days after Jacob's arrest and his relationship with Ben Rifkin. Andy said Ben sometimes teased Jacob. After being released on bail, Jacob became withdrawn since he couldn't go back to school yet. They hired a tutor, Mrs. Mandel. Lori decided to return to work, hoping it would distract her. Her colleagues wanted to support her, but Jacob's case could hurt the orphanage's reputation and funding, so Lori was put on leave. Jacob got into online games and hardly talked to his parents. Andy reminded him not to talk to anyone online during the investigation. Jacob knew he was famous. He even had a fan page. Andy got a message from Duffy asking him to check the mailbox. He found Leonard Patz's file there. Lori came home upset, and they didn't notice the graffiti on the garage wall telling Jacob to burn in hell. Lori cried in the bathroom, while Andy scrubbed the graffiti off, not wanting Jacob to see it. In the morning, Lori went for a run, wanting something in her life to feel normal. She remembered a time years ago when Jacob almost dropped a bowling ball on another boy, but she stopped him in time. Now, in the park, she saw a memorial for Ben. At the trial, Neil asked about genetics and behavior. The couple had consulted Dr. Elizabeth Vogel, a specialist, to ensure heredity wasn't relevant. Dr. Vogel asked what Jacob was like as a child. They said he was difficult and cried a lot, sometimes throwing tantrums. Lori admitted Jacob could be cruel to others, but Andy insisted he was just a normal kid. Lori believed in Jacob's innocence, but wanted to be honest with the doctor. Toby, an old friend, visited the Barbers, hugged Lori, and expressed sympathy. Jacob was busy studying. Lori threw away all the food Toby brought because Toby's husband didn't want her to associate with the Barbers anymore. The public was still reeling from Ben's death. Meanwhile, Leonard Patz was feeling pleased with himself. Sarah Grohl called Detective Duffy with information about Ben's case. Andy made dinner and called for Lori, but she didn't respond. He found her painting over the graffiti on the garage. The family was going through a tough time, each coping in their own way. Later, they met with Joanna Klein, who asked Jacob why he wanted to buy a hunting knife and why Derek Yu blamed him. Jacob said he just liked the knife and didn't know why Derek accused him. Unfortunately, Andy had thrown the knife away, so they couldn't prove it wasn't the crime weapon. That morning, Jacob went to school through the park. Before finding the body, he didn't see or hear anything unusual. Realizing Ben was dead, Jacob got scared and ran away, not knowing why he didn't call 911 or tell anyone. Witnesses said Jacob seemed happy that morning. Jacob couldn't explain his behavior and got confused. Joanna told Jacob his story had inconsistencies. They needed to prepare better or the jury wouldn't believe him. Andy decided Jacob shouldn't testify, and the lawyer agreed. Joanna's strategy was to dismantle the prosecution's case. While Lori and Jacob waited in the car, Joanna told Andy all the evidence was against them, but promised to do her best. Andy intended to link Leonard Patz to the case. Derek was called in for questioning again. Lori found something in the mail that made her uneasy and hid it. At dinner, Jacob said he didn't want to pretend they were a normal family anymore. Lori said pretending was the only thing keeping them sane. Andy made a joke to lighten the mood. That evening, Andy and Jacob watched an old comedy, and Andy was happy to hear Jacob's genuine laughter, as was Lori. They wanted the nightmare to end for Jacob. Lori found a letter containing documents that would later be evidence in court. The newspapers called William Barber Bloody Billy Barber. Andy had a tough childhood and feared his father. Lori asked if Andy ever thought thought Jacob was guilty. He answered without hesitation, no. The next day, Andy visited Matt McGrath, a victim of Leonard Patz, who accused him of inappropriate actions years ago. Matt didn't want to talk, and his mother asked Andy to leave. Dr. Vogel did a psychological test on Jacob to see if he had violent tendencies, making Lori nervous. Afterward, Lori said they were late for the tutor and had to go. Andy went to the hardware store where Leonard Patz worked and followed him home. Andy was surprised to see Sarah in Jacob's room. He was glad not all of Jacob's friends had turned away. Lori went to the orphanage for the spring festival, pretending to be at dinner with a friend. On the way home, she stopped at a diner and met a woman named Janine, who seemed friendly. Lori was happy to talk to someone nice for a change. In the evening, Andy and Jacob talked about Sarah thinking Derek was guilty. Jacob didn't believe it, but didn't know why Derek bad-mouthed him. Lori opened up to Janine, not realizing she was a journalist from the Boston Globe until it was too late. Remembering the lawyer's advice, Lori quickly left. At home, Lori couldn't bring herself to tell Andy what had happened. Secretly, against his parents' wishes, Jacob created a new Instagram account before going to bed. Andy told Lori he felt like their lives were getting back to normal, and even joked that Jacob might get a girlfriend soon. Jacob wanted an Instagram account to talk to Sarah, follow her blog, and see how popular he was. Andy told Lori that Sarah thought Derek might be involved in the case. Andy's main goal now is to protect his son, with Joanna's help. In the present, at the trial, Neil Logitis talked about William Barber's case, describing him as a monster with no remorse. He asked Andy if he ever feared Jacob might inherit his grandfather's violent tendencies. Andy said he never thought about it. He wanted his son to have a better childhood than he did. In the past, Dr. Elizabeth Vogel had Jacob take all the necessary tests, including a DNA test to detect the cruelty gene. A sample was also taken from Andy. Dr. Vogel wanted a sample from William, but he would only agree if Andy asked him personally. Reluctantly, Andy agreed to visit his father in prison. Lori watched him leave in the morning, feeling the weight of the situation. Andy dreaded seeing his father again after so many years. After the choir performance at school, Joan Rifkin took the stage, thanking the school for creating Ben's Fund and urging parents to appreciate their children. Andy arrived at the prison and met his father after 17 years. William knew he was a bad person, but believed a son should never turn his back on his father. Andy had never visited him, not even when his mother died. William only learned about his grandson from the news and offered to help if Andy used his connections to get him parole. Andy refused, and William declined to help. Later, Andy discussed this with Joanna. Believing his father always intended to give a DNA sample, Andy ignored a call from an unknown number and saw a Boston Globe interview with Lori. Lori had unknowingly talked to a reporter, not realizing it until the last moment. Sarah visited the Barbers again, having found a summer job. The couple was glad Jacob had a good friend. At the trial, Neil asked Andy if he or Lori ever doubted Jacob's innocence. Andy said they never did. In the past, Lori went grocery shopping, but felt no joy in it anymore. She unexpectedly ran into Joan, who spat in her face. Lori left the store immediately. Andy went to Detective Paula Duffy's training session to ask if Derek was a suspect. Duffy said they had one tip, but Derek had an alibi. His mom drove him to school that morning. Despite their parents' rules, Jacob and Sarah were texting a lot. Andy was spying on Derek, while Lori prepared for an unscheduled meeting with Dr. Vogel. Convinced Derek was hiding something, Andy discreetly punctured the tire of Derek's mom's car, delaying her from picking him up. Andy approached Derek at the bus stop and asked about the online messages. Derek hinted that Jacob had a darker side and watched violent videos, leaving Andy unsure how to react. When Derek's mom arrived, Derek left quickly. Lori told Dr. Vogel about a strange incident when Jacob was 5, blaming herself for not noticing warning signs. Dr. Vogel reassured Lori, saying doubts were normal. Lori just wanted to understand the situation. Andy visited Sarah at her ice cream shop job and thanked her for supporting Jacob. He suspected she was the one who called Detective Duffy about Derek. Sarah confessed that Ben's phone hadn't gone missing. Derek had it the whole time. Ben had blackmailed Sarah with an indecent photo she sent, and Derek, who liked Sarah, promised to handle it, stealing Ben's phone. 2 days later, Ben was found dead. Andy shared this with his family and lawyer. Joanna planned to contact Detective Duffy to investigate further. Jacob was upset about Sarah's interactions with Ben, thinking she felt guilty. He insulted her in a message, and Sarah understood why. Andy suggested they go fishing to help Jacob relax. At the trial, Neil asked Andy about his talk with Derek. Andy said he never caught Jacob watching violent videos, implying Derek lied. While fishing, Jacob admitted he was scared about the trial. Andy promised to protect him. Joanna later confirmed that Ben's phone was with the police, and that William agreed to give a DNA sample. The Barbers watched a comedy together, feeling like a normal family. Andy suspected Lori had visited his father to persuade him. Unable to sleep, Andy got another call from an unknown number. Matt McGrath had tried to do the right thing, but lacked the courage to speak. At the trial, Neil asked when Andy got Ben's phone. Andy said it was 10 days before the trial. After obtaining a court order with Joanna, Neil Logitis was not happy. Joanna Klein told him off for hiding evidence, and he got mad when Neil made a rude joke about Andy's dad. Joanna calmed Andy down, saying it was bound to come out eventually. Detective Paula Duffy handed over Ben's phone to Joanna and Andy, who immediately started digging through it. Meanwhile, Dr. Elizabeth Vogel had her last session with Jacob, and Lori mentioned his birthday was coming up. In the car ride home, Jacob barely talked, saying the sessions with Dr. Vogel were repetitive and tiresome. When Lori asked about Sarah, Jacob said they weren't in touch anymore and shut down the conversation. Ben's phone didn't have anything unusual, just typical teenager stuff. Andy was frustrated, hoping for answers. Detective Duffy noticed and told Andy that Neil's behavior was out of line. Andy was too tired to be angry. Everyone knew about his dad's life sentence anyway. Pam, who understood Andy well since her brother was also in prison, advised Andy not to underestimate Neil, who was confident he would win. Joanna found out from her assistant that Jacob was back on social media. At home, Andy yelled at Jacob for secretly creating an Instagram account and posting a picture of himself with an axe. Jacob said it was a joke, but Andy knew it looked bad and could be used against them in court, making Jacob seem like a psychopath. Jacob deleted the account, but the photo could still be out there. Andy just wanted to protect Jacob, but it felt like Jacob didn't grasp the seriousness or had moved past it. In prison, William Barber saw the news about himself and Jacob. People speculated about a family reunion behind bars, and it was all over the media. But Andy and Lori were helpless to stop it. Andy noticed a suspicious car when he took out the trash and told Lori. When they went outside together, the car was gone. Maybe he was just paranoid. That night, he got another call from an unknown number, and this time the caller spoke. Andy met Matt McGrath at a cafe. When Andy asked if Matt had come to his house in a dark blue car, Matt was confused. Suddenly, Matt said Jacob was innocent. The next day, Matt was interrogated with his mother present. He recounted how Leonard Patz had offered him lunch years ago, trying to seem cool, but coming off as a loser. When Leonard stopped paying Matt for indecent favor, Matt reported him to the police out of spite. Matt had seen Leonard with a new interest, Ben, and this could change everything. Lynn Canavan and Neil knew this was important. Matt also mentioned Leonard had a knife. Neil wasn't happy with this development. Matt assured him Andy didn't pressure him. Matt hadn't wanted to get involved, but couldn't stop thinking about Jacob possibly being imprisoned for nothing. Lynn wasn't sure what to believe, but Neil didn't trust Matt's story and got a search warrant for Patz's apartment. Jacob told his family the good news that Patz was now a suspect and he might not even go to trial. Andy thanked his father, William, for his help. The police prepared to search Patz's apartment, where Leonard was asleep on the couch. He woke up to the knock and didn't resist when he saw the search warrant. The next morning, Lori went for her usual run and noticed a dark blue Lincoln following her. She panicked and ran through the yard. At home, Andy and Detective Duffy were waiting. The police didn't find a knife at Patz's apartment, but he remained a suspect. Lori told them about the stalking, but she couldn't see the driver. Pam told them to call her if anyone bothered them and admitted things looked bad. Matt had framed Patz before, so it was possible he was doing it again. Neil asked Andy if he hoped to avoid trial. Andy said he hoped to delay it. He and Pam had gone over every detail of the case. With the trial approaching, Andy started following Leonard and even rammed his car, convinced Leonard was the real culprit. 4 days before the trial, Jacob turned 15 and spent his birthday studying to distract himself. Dr. Vogel's report stated that Jacob was highly intelligent but almost incapable of empathy, with a genetic predisposition to aggression like all Barber men, including Andy. Joanna thought this could help in court, even if Jacob was found guilty, to avoid a life sentence. Lori was worried and asked Dr. Vogel if Jacob could commit such a crime. The doctor's face said it all, and Lori was devastated. Andy suggested they celebrate Jacob's birthday at a restaurant, but the mood was somber. Jacob asked about their talk with Dr. Vogel, and they only told him he didn't have the cruelty gene, which relieved him. After dinner, Jacob thanked his parents, glad to feel like a normal family for a bit. Seeing the blue Lincoln again, Andy confronted the driver, who denied watching them, but advised Andy to protect his family before driving off. Andy called Pam with the car's license plate, and she found it was stolen. Pam promised to patrol the area. Lori, exhausted, went to bed, and Jacob wished her good night. At the trial, Andy said it would be over in 2 days. The trial was inevitable. On the way to the courthouse, the press followed them. In the car, they were silent. Once, Andy was Neil's mentor, but now things had changed. In the courtroom, Jacob was anxious. Dan Rifkin glared at Andy. Judge Pamela French granted 3 requests from the defense. Andy could represent the defense. Jacob's grandfather wouldn't be mentioned, and Matt McGrath and Leonard Patz were added to the witness list. journalist. Neil's opening statement claimed Jacob attacked Ben out of revenge for bullying. Joanna Klein was all about proving Jacob Barber's innocence. She thought the investigation was too quick to judge and that all the evidence was just circumstantial. When the Barbers left the courthouse, the press was all over them. Andy saw the driver again and told Detective Paula Duffy, who quickly eyed the guy and made him show his driver's license. The guy was super hesitant. Reporters camped outside the Barber's house, even at night. Jacob missed Sarah and texted her, which made her happy. Andy found out from Pam that the driver's name was James O'Leary, a former gangster now known as Father O'Leary, likely hired to scare the Barbers. But there was no reason to arrest him yet. At the next hearing, witnesses lined up to testify. Detective Jonathan Peterson, one of the first on the scene, praised Andy Barber for his professionalism. As an assistant district attorney, Andy was known for not making mistakes, so it was no surprise he led the Park crime investigation. Initially, the main suspect was Leonard Patz, but he was cleared after Jacob's arrest. Peterson still had doubts about Patz's innocence. After the hearing, Joanna had lunch at the Barber's place. Andy got a call from his dad, William Barber, who told him to do whatever it took to keep Jacob out of prison because it's a terrible place. Then hung up. Andy didn't tell his wife about the call. When Lori found out Jacob was talking to Sarah again, she was happy. She hoped that if Jacob was found not guilty, he could go back to a normal life. At another hearing, forensic expert Karen Carlson said the attack could have come from behind, which reminded Lori of an incident at the bowling alley. Prosecutor Neil Logaitis tried to present a hunting knife similar to the one Derek Hughes said Jacob had, but Joanna objected, and the judge didn't allow the knife into evidence. Joanna's defense seemed solid. She argued that Jacob found Ben Rifkin's body in the woods and, thinking Ben was unconscious, shook him, leaving fingerprints on Ben's hoodie. Carlson confirmed this was possible. During a break, Lori overheard Dan Rifkin angrily claiming Jacob would get away with it. Joanna's confidence reassured the Barbers, making Jacob feel at ease. Then, Detective Duffy testified about finding violent videos on Jacob's laptop, which shocked Lori. When Logaitis tried to bring up Jacob's grandfather, the judge had enough. She warned him that mentioning William Barber again could get the trial annulled. The judge told the jury to ignore Logaitis' last question. Neil asked Andy if he trusted Joanna Klein, and Andy said he did. On the fourth day of hearings, Derek Yu testified against Jacob, saying Jacob didn't seem worried the day he supposedly found the body. Derek also talked about how Ben taunted Jacob, who started carrying a hunting knife. Derek mentioned a detailed story Jacob posted online about what he did to Ben, which made Jacob nervous since Joanna hadn't seen it before. The judge gave Joanna time to confer with Jacob. Joanna figured there was no point denying Jacob wrote the story since his IP address was linked to it. When Andy asked Joanna if things were bad, her expression said it all. Derek read the story aloud, and Dan Rifkin and his wife couldn't hold back their tears. The story, posted 3 days after the incident, made Lori cry too. After the hearing, the Barbers sat silently in their car. Jacob said it was just a story. Andy asked him directly if he killed Ben, and Jacob said no, which was enough for Andy. Joanna was trying to figure out how to salvage their defense. They needed to prove Derek was involved and show the jury he was obsessed with Sarah. Jacob didn't want to use her selfie, but they had no choice. Sarah ignored Jacob's messages and didn't answer his call. Lori was silent all evening. Andy admitted to knowing about Jacob's interest in violent sites, but hid it from Lori. When Lori said she believed Jacob was guilty, Andy couldn't believe it. Lori thought the story was a confession, while Andy insisted it was just fantasy. Lori was tired of lying and denying that their son might be a monster. She would love him no matter what, but didn't know how to live with it. Both realized their marriage was falling apart, and they'd never be a normal family again. Leonard Patz was seen crying and writing a letter to the Rifkins, confessing to killing Ben. Early in the morning, Joanna called, waking Andy, who then woke Lori to say Patz had died and left a confession note. This meant it was all over. Lori was stunned, but Andy reassured her. Joanna would file to dismiss the trial, and all charges against Jacob were dropped. Judge French told Jacob he was free, and the family felt relieved, hugging in the courtroom. The Barbers spoke to the press, thanking Joanna for her help. In a parking lot, Dan Rifkin accused Jacob of being guilty. Father O'Leary, an old friend of Andy's dad, stopped Dan. It seemed everything ended well, but journalists still followed the Barbers, seeing the news. William felt joy, knowing his grandson was safe. Only Neil Logaitis was unhappy. The Barbers tried to move on, but knew life would never be the same. Lori felt guilty for doubting Jacob, while Andy wanted to start fresh. In court, Andy said they'd move later. One day, at a cafe, they talked about a trip to Mexico. Lori felt ashamed for not supporting Andy during the trial. Andy planned to resign resign, feeling he couldn't continue his job after being on the other side. The investigation into Pat's case was done, with some inconsistencies resolved. Seeing a crowbar in his car, Andy remembered Father O'Leary. Laurie was recovering, but Andy was still deep in thought. Andy soon visited his father in prison and directly asked if he was behind everything. William pretended not to know who Father O'Leary was, but Andy had read the crime scene report from Pat's apartment and knew something was off. Neighbors had seen a Lincoln without plates near the house that night. William eventually admitted that O'Leary had forced Leonard to write the confession note, making it look like Leonard had taken his own life out of guilt. In reality, O'Leary had killed Leonard in his own apartment to protect Jacob. Andy said it wasn't necessary, but William didn't share that confidence. They both realized they weren't sure if Jacob was guilty or not, leaving Andy torn between being an honest man or a good father. William felt like neither, but Andy still had a choice. William was happy to reconnect with Andy and wanted to meet Jacob, though that seemed unlikely. Andy felt lost and uncertain about what to do next, which was unsettling. Laurie, unaware of everything, was simply enjoying their normal life. Before bed, she noticed Andy seemed distant, but he brushed it off, saying he was thinking about their upcoming move and his career. Now, Andy just wanted to leave everything behind and move on, a decision Laurie supported, hoping there would be no more secrets in their family. The family finally took their long-awaited vacation to Mexico. Right around Christmas Eve, Jacob was becoming quite popular, seen as cool by many. The Barbers had a great time. Just as they'd hoped, Jacob even spent a lot of time with a new friend, Hope Connors. Andy tried to appear happy, but deep down, he knew it was all just a facade, because he still didn't know if Jacob was involved in Ben's death. During the trial, Neil asked Andy about New Year's Eve. Jacob had asked to go to a beach party with Hope, and Andy and Laurie agreed. They had a quiet dinner alone, talking about their past and future, and despite everything, they felt their love had grown stronger. But when they returned to the hotel, they found Jacob upset and distant. They didn't press him and just wished him a happy new year before heading to bed. The next morning, while the family was having breakfast, police officers arrived to talk to Jacob because Hope hadn't returned from the party. The family was taken to the police station. In the present, at the trial, Andy said Jacob told them he and Hope had argued before the party, and then Jacob had supposedly returned to the hotel. The police didn't believe him, even though the Barbers did. Laurie was devastated, feeling like a nightmare was starting all over again. Andy never told Laurie that Leonard Patz might not have been guilty. One night, Laurie found Andy on the balcony, drinking, and he confessed that his father had killed Leonard with a friend's help. Laurie was horrified, now sure that Jacob might be guilty and involved in Hope's disappearance. Andy asked if she wanted him to tell the police everything, but Laurie couldn't answer, feeling ill. That same night, Hope was found. She'd met a guy at the party who had spiked her drink. The Barbers were relieved, but their emotions were complex. They decided to cut the vacation short and return home. Laurie avoided talking about Leonard Patz, and that conversation might never happen. She couldn't stop thinking about a horrifying story Jacob had told online, feeling guilty for raising a monster. Back in the US, they tried to maintain a semblance of normal life. Jacob kept up with his studies, but Laurie couldn't keep pretending. 2 weeks later, they put their house up for sale. In court, Neil asked why Laurie wasn't present. Laurie had gone for a late-night walk while Andy packed and played a board game with Jacob. When Jacob asked what was wrong with his mom, Andy said she was stressed about the move. Laurie, trying to do the right thing, visited the Rifkin house and saw Joanna through the window, drinking wine and crying. Laurie couldn't bear it and ran away. At home, Andy kept packing, worried about Laurie, who looked at Jacob every day, wondering how to move forward. The next day, Laurie was driving Jacob to the barbershop. She gathered the courage to ask him if he had killed Ben. Andy realized Laurie was up to something and tried calling her, but she ignored him. Jacob denied it, but Laurie didn't believe him and started speeding. Jacob begged her to stop, but she wouldn't until she heard the truth. They got into an accident. The car was wrecked, and Andy kept trying to reach Laurie. This was a month and a half ago. Both Laurie and Jacob ended up in intensive care in critical condition. In court, Andy claimed Laurie lost control of the car, but Neil didn't buy it, pointing out she'd called Jacob's former lawyer twice before the accident without speaking. Andy is determined to protect Jacob. Even as Neil tried to convince him that the truth could set them all free, Andy stood by his story of the accident. He later visited Jacob in the hospital, where Jacob remained in a coma, feeling powerless. Laurie's condition had stabilized, and Andy, despite everything, stayed by her side. He assured her no charges would be pressed against her. Laurie regretted everything deeply. Doctors couldn't promise Jacob would wake up, and Laurie had partially lost her memory of the accident. Both she and Andy wished for things to go back to normal. Andy returned to their empty house, determined to be a good father and husband.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel out. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss an update. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment below with your suggestions for future videos, any questions you have, or just to say hi. Your feedback is super important to us and helps us create better content for you. Also, feel free to share this video with your friends, family, and on social media. It really makes a big difference and helps our community grow. You can follow us on Insert your social media handles for more updates and behind-the-scenes content. Thanks again for your support, and we'll see you in the next video.